The trauma bay doors burst open so hard they slammed against the wall. Female, mid-30s. BP dropping. Internal bleeding suspected. A paramedic shouted as he and his partner rushed a blood-soaked woman toward Trauma Room 3. Monitors screamed. Nurses scattered into motion. A respiratory therapist wheeled in a ventilator while a resident searched desperately for an open physician. Standing in the center of the chaos, Grace Holloway didn't raise her voice. She never had to. "Lucas, ultrasound first," she called to the attending physician. "Jenny, get 2 units of O-negative. Ethan, prep for intubation. Somebody call CT and tell them we're coming if she stabilizes." The room instantly found its rhythm. Dr. Lucas Ramirez looked at Grace with the quiet confidence he developed after working beside her for nearly 8 years. "I didn't even have to ask." Grace gave a faint smile while slipping on another pair of gloves. "You were going to." 30 seconds later, the ultrasound confirmed her suspicion. Splenic rupture. Without immediate surgery, the woman wouldn't survive another hour. "Or is ready," someone called. Grace squeezed the frightened patient's hand before the anesthesiologist took over. "You're going to wake up," she said gently. "And when you do, your husband will be waiting." The woman managed the smallest nod before disappearing through the operating room doors. Only then did Grace finally exhale. Another life. Another crisis. Another ordinary Tuesday at Rocky Mountain Regional Medical Center. She glanced at the wall clock. 9:42 a.m. Her 12-hour shift wasn't even halfway finished. Grace walked toward the nurse's station carrying a clipboard thick with unfinished charts. Before she reached it, someone wrapped both arms around her shoulders. "You skipped breakfast again." Grace laughed. "Good morning to you too, Maya." Maya Bennett, one of the younger ER nurses, handed her a protein bar. "You tell every patient to take care of themselves." "I know, but you never listen to your own advice." Grace accepted the snack. "I owe you." "You owe me breakfast." "Deal." Their conversation ended as another ambulance notification appeared across the emergency department monitors. "Incoming trauma. 3 minutes. Motorcycle accident." Everyone immediately returned to work. No complaints. No hesitation. This was what emergency medicine looked like. Fast decisions. Controlled urgency. Quiet courage. On the opposite side of the hospital, the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. The executive conference room overlooked downtown Denver through floor-to-ceiling windows. Fresh coffee. Leather chairs. Quarterly financial reports. Hospital Director Dr. Nathan Caldwell sat at the head of the polished table while Chief Operations Executive Ethan Brooks clicked through another presentation. "Our operating margin improved by 6% this quarter." Several board members nodded approvingly. Brooks smiled. "Staffing efficiency continues exceeding expectations." No one mentioned that staffing efficiency meant leaving emergency nurses responsible for more patients than ever before. One board member finally spoke. "Any concerns?" Brooks answered before anyone else could. "Nothing significant." Dr. Caldwell scanned the report. No red flags. No warnings. No indication that dozens of nurses had filed internal complaints over unsafe staffing levels during the previous 6 months. Those reports had never reached his desk. Back downstairs, Grace caught sight of an elderly man sitting alone in the waiting room. He clutched his chest, but kept apologizing every time the receptionist checked on him. "I'm fine," he insisted. "I don't want to bother anybody." Grace walked over. "Sir." He looked up nervously. "My name's Grace. I already told them I'll wait." She knelt beside him. "Can I ask you one question?" He nodded. "When did the chest pain start?" "About 40 minutes ago." "Any nausea?" "A little." "Sweating?" He hesitated. "Yes." Grace didn't wait another second. She pressed the emergency call button. "We need room 7 now." The receptionist looked surprised. "He isn't next." "I know, but he's having a heart attack." Within moments, the waiting room erupted into organized movement. Minutes later, an EKG confirmed Grace's suspicion: massive myocardial infarction. Had he waited another 20 minutes, he likely wouldn't have survived. Dr. Ramirez shook his head. "You keep making the rest of us look slow." Grace shrugged. "I just listen." Around noon, the emergency department received another ambulance notification. This one felt different. The paramedics entered pushing a construction worker whose clothes were covered in concrete, dust, and blood. 32 years old. Fell nearly 20 feet. Blood pressure crashing. Possible liver laceration. Grace immediately recognized how unstable he was. "We need trauma 1. The paramedic handed over the chart. No insurance information. Before anyone could respond, an administrative coordinator hurried into the trauma bay carrying a tablet. "There are instructions from patient placement." Grace looked up. "What instructions?" "The trauma unit is approaching capacity. So, they want this patient transferred to Memorial East." Grace stared at her. "He won't survive a transfer. I'm just delivering the message." Dr. Ramirez frowned. "Who approved that?" "The administration office." Grace looked back at the patient. His pulse was fading beneath her fingertips. She didn't need another CT scan. She didn't need another opinion. Every second mattered. She looked directly at Dr. Ramirez. "If we move him, he dies." The room fell silent. Dr. Ramirez hesitated. He understood exactly what Grace meant. But administrative directives weren't suggestions. They carried consequences. Grace stepped closer to the stretcher. "Doctor." Her voice remained calm. "We either operate here." She glanced toward the elevator where transport staff already waited. "Or we pronounce him somewhere else." Dr. Ramirez looked from Grace to the patient, then toward the hallway where hospital administration was already expecting compliance. For the first time that day, no one moved. No one in Trauma Room 1 spoke. The only sounds came from the heart monitor, the oxygen mask, and the construction worker's shallow, uneven breathing. Dr. Lucas Ramirez knew exactly what Grace was asking him to do. Ignore an administrative directive. If they were wrong, both of them could lose their jobs. If they obeyed the order, the man on the stretcher might lose his life. Grace checked the patient's pupils. "They're slowing." The blood pressure monitor flashed again. 78/42. Lower than before. She looked directly into Dr. Ramirez's eyes. "Lucas, we don't have 20 minutes." He glanced toward the doorway where Administrative Supervisor Karen Ellis had arrived. "Dr. Ramirez," Karen said firmly, "patient placement has already coordinated the transfer. Memorial East has accepted him." Grace didn't even look up. "They're 23 minutes away in today's traffic." Karen folded her arms. "Those are the director's instructions." "No," Grace replied calmly. "Those are someone's interpretation of the director's instructions." Karen's expression hardened. "Are you refusing an administrative order?" Grace finally stood. "I'm refusing to let a dying man become paperwork." The room fell silent again. Even the younger nurses stopped moving. Everyone understood what was happening. This wasn't just about one patient anymore. It was about who controlled medical decisions, the people at the bedside or the people reading occupancy reports. Dr. Ramirez took a slow breath. "Prep the OR." Karen stepped forward. "Doctor, you can't." "I said," he interrupted quietly, "prep the OR." For a brief moment, relief washed over Grace's face. Then she went right back to work. 2 more units of blood. Call surgery. Notify anesthesia. Let's move. Within seconds, the team rolled the patient toward the operating suite. As the doors closed behind them, Karen pulled out her phone. I'm documenting this entire incident. Grace never answered. She had already forgotten about Karen. She was thinking only about the man whose heartbeat was still barely hanging on. 3 hours later, Grace finally walked into the staff lounge. She leaned against the vending machine and closed her eyes for exactly 5 seconds. You're famous. She opened one eye. Maya stood there holding 2 coffees. I was hoping for invisible. You can stop hoping. Maya handed her a cup. The whole hospital knows. Grace accepted it. How's the patient? Maya smiled. He made it through surgery. Grace closed her eyes again. Not in exhaustion. In gratitude. Good. That's all you have to say? What else matters? Maya shook her head. You're unbelievable. Before Grace could answer, her phone buzzed. Administrative hearing, 3:30 p.m. Attendance required. She stared at the screen. So? Maya whispered. They're really doing this. Grace slipped the phone back into her pocket. They have to. No, they don't. They think I broke protocol. You saved a man's life. Grace gave a tired smile. Sometimes those become the same thing. At exactly 3:30 that afternoon, Grace entered conference room B. The atmosphere felt colder than the emergency department ever had. Dr. Nathan Caldwell sat at the center of the table. Beside him sat Karen Ellis, a human resources representative, and Chief Operations Executive Ethan Brooks. A folder rested in front of each of them. Dr. Caldwell looked up. Ms. Holloway, thank you for coming. Grace nodded. You've been informed of today's review? Yes. Caldwell folded his hands. Did you knowingly disregard an approved patient transfer? I did. Karen immediately added. Despite direct administrative instruction, Grace answered without hesitation. Yes. Brooks leaned forward. And why? Because he would have died. Silence. Brooks opened another document. Our records indicate another trauma center had available capacity. Grace looked directly at him. Our records don't account for Colorado traffic. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Dr. Caldwell remained composed. The issue isn't whether the patient survived. Grace blinked. It isn't. The issue is whether hospital policy was followed. Grace took a slow breath. Respectfully, doctor. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She was simply honest. My nursing license requires me to protect patients before policies. The sentence lingered in the room. Brooks closed the folder. This attitude creates institutional risk. Grace answered softly. No. She looked around the room. It prevents funerals. Another silence. Longer this time. Dr. Caldwell finally spoke. Until a formal investigation is completed. He paused. You are suspended without clinical duties. The words landed like a physical blow. Not because Grace hadn't expected them. Because she realized no one in the room had asked the only question that mattered. Would the patient have survived the transfer? No one asked. The meeting was over. 40 minutes later, Grace emptied her locker. A framed photo of Emma. A worn coffee mug that read World's Okayest Mom. Her trauma shears. A faded thank you card from a little girl she treated years earlier. Thank you for staying with me until my mom came. She slipped the card into her bag. Maya appeared beside her. They'll fix this. Grace forced a smile. I hope so. Dr. Ramirez walked into the locker room. He looked ashamed. I should have said more. Grace shook her head. You already did. I let you stand alone. No. She placed a hand on his shoulder. You operated. You saved him too. He looked away. It doesn't feel like it. Grace picked up her cardboard box. Then next time, she smiled gently. Speak a little louder. She stepped outside into the freezing Denver evening. Snowflakes had just begun drifting from the darkening sky. For the first time in years, She wasn't heading home after a shift. She was leaving without knowing if she'd ever wear her hospital badge again. Grace reached her pickup truck and placed the box inside. Her phone buzzed, then buzzed again. And again. Not a text. An emergency alert. Mass casualty incident. Interstate 70 tunnel collapse. Multiple vehicle collision. Estimated victims, 50 plus. All available medical personnel report immediately. Grace stared at the screen. A second notification appeared. Emergency staffing requested. She slowly looked back toward the hospital. Ambulances screamed past the entrance. Fire engines followed. Medical helicopters circled overhead. Her suspension suddenly meant nothing. Inside that building, people were about to run out of time. Grace quietly closed her truck door. Then, without saying a word, she turned around and ran back toward the emergency entrance. Grace shoved through the emergency department doors just as the first wave of ambulances arrived. The waiting room had transformed into controlled chaos. Police officers guided frantic families away from the entrance. Firefighters carried victims on stretchers because there weren't enough gurneys. The hospital intercom repeated the same announcement every 30 seconds. Mass Casualty Protocol Level 3 is now in effect. All available trauma personnel report immediately. Grace instinctively reached for the ID badge clipped to her jacket. Then she remembered. It no longer worked. She was suspended. For half a second, she hesitated. Then she heard a little boy crying. The sound erased every doubt. She walked straight toward the triage area. Inside, nurses were already overwhelmed. Victims lined the hallway because every trauma room was occupied. Bloodstained blankets covered the floor. The electronic tracking board flashed red from top to bottom. A young nurse looked up in disbelief. "Grace." Another whispered, "She's back." Grace didn't answer. She grabbed a triage clipboard from an abandoned desk. "Who has command?" "No one," the charge nurse admitted. "Dr. Ramirez is in surgery. 3 attendings are tied up. EMS keeps bringing more patients." Grace nodded once. "Then we don't have time to wait." She climbed onto a small step near the nurse's station. "Everyone listen." The room gradually quieted. If you have a patient who isn't breathing, they go directly to trauma 1 or 2. Red tags stay inside the ER. Yellow tags move to the outpatient procedure wing. Green tags go to the conference center. We save the operating rooms for patients we can actually stabilize. No one questioned her. They simply moved. Within seconds, confusion gave way to purpose. Outside, another ambulance screamed into the bay. Captain Marcus Reed jumped out before the vehicle stopped moving. His uniform was streaked with soot and snow. "Grace." He blinked in surprise. "I thought they suspended you." "They did." He looked around. "Then what are you doing here?" She accepted the clipboard he handed her. "Working." Marcus laughed despite the exhaustion written across his face. "That's exactly what I expected you'd say." He lowered his voice. "We've got at least 20 more coming." "How bad?" His expression answered before he spoke. "Worse than anything since the wildfire evacuations." Grace inhaled slowly. "Okay." Marcus pointed toward another arriving ambulance. "There's something else." "What?" The tunnel roof partially collapsed. Grace froze. "Meaning?" Some victims were trapped nearly 40 minutes before rescue crews reached them. Internal crush injuries, hypothermia, smoke inhalation, complications on top of trauma. The numbers suddenly became even more dangerous. Inside Trauma Bay 3, Dr. Lucas Ramirez emerged from surgery still wearing a blood-spotted gown. He stopped the moment he saw Grace directing triage. Relief flashed across his face. "You came." Grace kept writing patient assignments. "Apparently. They'll throw us both out after this." She finally looked at him. If everyone survives long enough to complain, I'll take that risk. Lucas couldn't help smiling. He turned toward the crowded hallway. All physicians' heads turned immediately. From this moment forward, Grace coordinates patient flow. Not a single doctor objected. Across the hospital, Dr. Nathan Caldwell stood inside the Emergency Operations Center watching security camera feeds. The hospital resembled a battlefield. Stretchers filled every corridor. Reporters gathered outside. Phones rang without stopping. A hospital administrator hurried into the room. We're already exceeding disaster capacity. Open overflow units. They're full. What about neighboring hospitals? They're receiving their own victims. Another staff member interrupted. Director. What? We've lost electronic charting in 2 wings after the power surge. Caldwell closed his eyes briefly. Paper charts. They're already being distributed. Before anyone spoke again, Security Chief Alan Pierce entered. We have another issue. Caldwell looked up. What now? A suspended employee entered the emergency department. Who? Nurse Grace Holloway. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Caldwell sighed. Is she treating patients? Alan nodded. Yes. Is anyone complaining? No. In fact, Alan hesitated. The emergency department seems more organized since she arrived. Caldwell stared silently at the monitor showing the triage desk. Grace moved from patient to patient with astonishing speed. No panic. No wasted motion. No hesitation. Just calm leadership. Before Caldwell could respond, Ethan Brooks entered carrying updated casualty reports. We have 57 confirmed victims. The room fell silent. 57. Far worse than anyone had predicted. Brooks continued. We're also receiving calls from state officials. Caldwell barely heard him. His eyes remained fixed on the security monitor. Grace was kneeling beside an elderly woman, reassuring her before directing another nurse toward a child whose oxygen levels were dropping. Despite being suspended, she hadn't spent 1 second defending herself. She hadn't demanded an apology. She hadn't asked for reinstatement. She had simply gone back to saving lives. For the first time that day, Dr. Nathan Caldwell began wondering whether he had made the biggest mistake of his career. A piercing alarm echoed through the emergency department. Not another ambulance. The blood bank. Grace looked up just as the overhead speaker crackled. Critical inventory warning. O-negative supply below emergency threshold. A heavy silence swept across the nurses' station. 57 victims. Multiple surgeries already underway. And the hospital was running dangerously low on universal donor blood. Dr. Lucas Ramirez walked over, pulling off a pair of blood-stained gloves. How much do we have left? The blood bank supervisor answered without looking up from her clipboard. Enough for maybe 6 more massive transfusions. Grace's jaw tightened. We're going to need a lot more than 6. Lucas nodded. I know. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Grace made a decision. Call neighboring hospitals. Request emergency transfers. They're already short. Call anyway. She turned to another nurse. Contact the regional blood center. They're 2 hours away. I don't care. Her voice remained calm. Every minute we delay is another minute someone bleeds. The nurse hurried away. Grace glanced across the emergency room. The chaos hadn't stopped. It had simply changed shape. One trauma patient stabilized while another crashed. A child stopped crying. An elderly man coded. A surgeon shouted for more suction. Every victory lasted seconds before another crisis took its place. Near the ambulance entrance, Captain Marcus Reed stepped inside carrying a folded highway map. He spread it across a supply cart. The interstate is closed in both directions. Grace looked at the map. What about air transport? Marcus shook his head. The snow's getting worse. She looked toward the windows. The flakes had become a blinding curtain. Helicopters were grounded, meaning every remaining victim was coming here by road. Marcus lowered his voice. We're still pulling people out of the tunnel. Grace closed her eyes for one brief second. How many? We honestly don't know. Across the hospital, Olivia Chen sat alone in the risk management office. She wasn't treating patients. She was reviewing emergency preparedness records for state investigators who had already called twice asking difficult questions. She opened the hospital's disaster response archive. Something felt wrong. A required preparedness report from 6 months earlier was missing. She searched again. Nothing. She frowned. Every accredited trauma center was legally required to document staffing readiness, equipment testing, and emergency response drills. Those files couldn't simply disappear, unless someone had removed them. Olivia requested the backup archive. The system returned. Access restricted. She blinked. Restricted? Preparedness reports weren't classified. She tried again. Same message. A chill ran through her. She picked up the office phone. IT department, this is Olivia Chen. Yes. I need access to archive disaster preparedness files. A pause. Then the technician answered quietly. Those permissions were changed 3 months ago. By whom? Another pause. I probably shouldn't say. Olivia's voice became firmer. This is part of an active disaster investigation. The technician sighed. The authorization came directly from Executive Operations. Executive Operations. Ethan Brooks. Olivia slowly lowered the receiver. For the first time in years, she wondered whether someone inside the hospital had been hiding more than paperwork. Back downstairs, Grace spotted a young nurse standing frozen beside a teenage patient. The monitor displayed dangerously low oxygen levels. The nurse's hands were trembling. Her voice cracked. I've never intubated anyone outside simulation. Grace stepped beside her. What's your name? Sophie. Grace smiled gently. Okay, Sophie. She placed a reassuring hand on the young nurse's shoulder. Look at me. Sophie did. You're not alone. Grace picked up the laryngoscope. I'm going to guide you. I don't think I can. You can. Grace spoke with complete confidence. I'll tell you every step. The room grew quiet. One breath at a time. One instruction at a time. Sophie successfully placed the breathing tube. The patient's oxygen level climbed. 88. 91. The entire room exhaled together. Sophie stared at the monitor. I actually did it. Grace smiled. No. She nodded toward the patient. We did. Nearby, another nurse whispered. That's why everyone follows her. Late that evening, Dr. Nathan Caldwell left the command center and walked into the emergency department for the first time since the disaster began. He stopped several feet away from Grace. She was helping transport an elderly woman toward intensive care. Neither of them spoke. Finally, Caldwell said quietly, How many have we lost? Grace looked down for a moment. 3. And saved. She looked around the crowded emergency department. I stopped counting. Caldwell followed her gaze. Doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, paramedics, janitors, volunteers, everyone was working beyond exhaustion. But one thing stood out. People weren't looking toward the director for guidance. They were looking toward Grace. Not because of her title, because of her example. Caldwell felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Humility. Before he could speak again, Security Chief Alan Pierce hurried over. Director, what is it? We've accounted for all 57 victims. Caldwell nodded slowly. And Alan glanced toward Grace. Against every projection, he struggled to believe the words himself. 54 are still alive. Silence. Even the surrounding staff looked up. 54. The survival rate was far beyond what anyone had expected under these conditions. Alan continued. The emergency response team keeps saying the same thing. What thing? They say patient flow never collapsed. His eyes shifted toward Grace. Because she kept it together. Caldwell looked at the nurse he had suspended less than 24 hours earlier. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't asking anyone to acknowledge her. She was already moving toward the next patient. As the director watched in silence, Olivia Chen appeared in the hallway holding a thick, confidential file against her chest. Her face had turned pale. She stopped beside Caldwell. We need to talk. Now. Right now. She opened the folder just enough for him to see the first page. Across the top, stamped in red, were the words, Emergency Preparedness Audit. Below it was a signature, authorized by Ethan Brooks. Olivia looked directly at the director. I think we've been asking the wrong questions. Olivia closed the folder before anyone else could see its contents. Director, she said quietly, not here. Dr. Nathan Caldwell studied her face. During the 10 years she'd served as the hospital's risk manager, he'd never seen her look shaken. What did you find? Somewhere private. Caldwell nodded. Alan, stay here. If anyone asks, tell them I'll be back in 5 minutes. The security chief acknowledged with a short nod as Caldwell followed Olivia down the hallway. Neither of them noticed Ethan Brooks watching from the glass wall of the Emergency Operations Center. His expression never changed, but his eyes followed the folder in Olivia's hands. Inside the risk management office, Olivia locked the door. She placed the thick binder on the desk and slowly opened it. 3 hours ago, she began, I was preparing documentation for the state investigators. Caldwell remained silent. I couldn't find our emergency preparedness audit. You mentioned that. So I requested archived records. And they'd been removed. Caldwell frowned. Removed? Not deleted. She slid a printed authorization form across the desk. Restricted. He picked it up. His eyebrows tightened. Authorization level, Executive Operations. Signed, Ethan Brooks. Caldwell looked up. There has to be an explanation. I thought so too. Olivia opened another section of the binder. This is last year's disaster readiness assessment. Several pages were highlighted. Grace had never seen these documents. Neither had most of the emergency department. The report listed multiple urgent recommendations. Replace aging portable ventilators. Increase overnight trauma staffing. Upgrade emergency power distribution. Expand blood storage capacity. Conduct tunnel collapse disaster simulation. Next to each recommendation, someone had written the same note. Deferred to next fiscal year. Every page carried Brooks' approval signature. Caldwell stared at the paperwork. Why wasn't I shown this? Olivia answered honestly. I don't know. But she was beginning to suspect someone did. Downstairs, Grace finally took a sip of coffee. It was cold. She didn't care. She hadn't sat down in nearly 6 hours. Emma flashed through her thoughts. She had texted only once. Love you. Stay safe, Mom. Grace smiled faintly before slipping the phone back into her pocket. No time. Another stretcher rolled through the doors. This victim was different. Not because of the injuries. Because he wore a firefighter's uniform. Captain Marcus Reed hurried beside the gurney. Structural collapse during secondary search. Grace immediately recognized the patient. Lieutenant Ben Walker. She'd treated him twice before after wildfires. Now his breathing sounded wet. Chest trauma. Possible collapsed lung. Lucas. Dr. Ramirez hurried over. What view we got? Grace pressed her stethoscope against Ben's chest. No breath sounds on the left. Lucas didn't hesitate. Tension pneumothorax. Grace already had the decompression kit open. Within seconds, a rush of trapped air escaped. Ben gasped violently before taking his first full breath. Marcus exhaled. I thought we lost him. Grace checked Ben's pulse. Not tonight. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. You know? What? I've worked disasters for 25 years. Grace kept adjusting 4 lines. So, I've never seen an emergency room recover from chaos this fast. She shrugged. It wasn't chaos. Marcus laughed. It sure looked like it. Grace smiled. People panic when they stop talking to each other. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Maybe that was her gift. Not medicine. Leadership. Across the hall, Sophie, the young nurse Grace had coached earlier, was now confidently managing 2 patients on her own. Maya walked beside her. Feeling better? Sophie actually smiled. I thought I was going to quit nursing. And now? She glanced toward Grace. I want to become like her. Maya looked over as Grace quietly comforted a frightened elderly woman waiting for surgery. Good luck. Sophie laughed. I know. Meanwhile, Ethan Brooks entered the executive conference room. He closed the door behind him. His assistant looked up. Everything all right? Brooks loosened his tie. Find Olivia Chun. What about her? I need every preparedness file she accessed today. The assistant hesitated. State investigators already requested. I didn't ask what they requested. His voice remained calm. I asked for the files. Right away. As the assistant hurried out, Brooks walked toward the window overlooking the ambulance entrance. Snow continued falling. Reporters crowded behind police barricades. Satellite trucks lined the street. This disaster was becoming national news. He couldn't allow internal financial decisions to become part of the story. Not now. Not ever. Back in the emergency department, Grace noticed something odd. A portable ventilator suddenly shut itself off. A respiratory therapist rushed over. What happened? It lost power. Grace checked the battery indicator. Dead. She frowned. Wasn't this serviced? It should have been. Another therapist arrived carrying a replacement. That one failed during startup. Grace's concern deepened. Where did these come from? Storage. When were they inspected? Nobody answered. Minutes later, a portable cardiac monitor also refused to boot. Then another. Grace looked toward Dr. Ramirez. Lucas. He immediately understood. This isn't random. No. She looked around the trauma bay. It's equipment. The realization hit both of them at the same time. These failures weren't caused by the tunnel collapse. They had existed before the first ambulance ever arrived. Someone had ignored them. And tonight, patients were paying the price. Grace stared at the dark screen of the second cardiac monitor. 2 ventilators. 1 monitor. A portable suction unit that had failed earlier. Individually, each malfunction could be dismissed as bad luck. Together, they formed a pattern. She turned to the biomedical technician rushing into the trauma bay. Jason. He looked up. What do you need? When was the last preventive maintenance on these units? Jason hesitated. I don't know. Grace narrowed her eyes. You don't know? They were supposed to be replaced. Supposed to. Jason glanced around to make sure no administrators were nearby. We submitted replacement requests months ago. Grace exchanged a quick look with Dr. Ramirez. What happened? Jason swallowed. They were denied. Across the hospital, Olivia spread more documents across the conference table. Dr. Caldwell stood silently, reading each page. Budget revisions. Equipment purchase requests. Staffing projections. Every document told the same story. Emergency preparedness spending had been repeatedly postponed. Not because the hospital lacked money, because leadership wanted stronger quarterly financial results before the annual board meeting. Caldwell rubbed his forehead. I never approved this. Olivia looked up. No. She slid another document toward him. You approved the annual operating budget. He read the margin notes. Individual department cuts had been reassigned after board approval. Small reductions, scattered across different departments. None large enough to attract attention alone. But together, they had quietly weakened the hospital's emergency readiness. It was hidden. Olivia nodded. Exactly. Back in the emergency department, another ambulance arrived carrying the final victim rescued from the collapsed tunnel. A teenage girl, 16 years old. Crush injuries to both legs. Hypothermia. Barely conscious. Captain Marcus Reed climbed out behind a stretcher. This was the last one. Grace checked the girl's pulse. Weak, but present. Trauma 4. Marcus caught Grace before she disappeared behind the curtain. There's something else. What? We've accounted for everyone. Grace nodded. That's good. Marcus didn't smile. It is. He lowered his voice. But rescue crews said something strange. Grace waited. They expected far more fatalities. She looked at him. They told me several victims survived because treatment started immediately after arriving. Marcus glanced toward the crowded emergency department. They kept saying. He smiled. Someone inside this hospital never let the system fall apart. Grace shook her head. It wasn't one person. No. Marcus agreed. It started with one. Several hours passed. The emergency department slowly shifted from rescue to recovery. Some patients were moved upstairs. Others entered surgery. The waiting room finally grew quieter. For the first time all night, Grace sat down, only for 30 seconds. Maya handed her another cup of coffee. This one's hot. Grace smiled. You're learning. Maya laughed. You trained me. Grace looked around the room. Young nurses were confidently handling patients. Residents communicated clearly. Paramedics worked side by side with physicians. Nobody cared about titles anymore. Everyone cared about outcomes. Maybe disasters had a strange way of revealing who people really were. The quiet didn't last. Security Chief Alan Pierce hurried toward Dr. Caldwell. Director, what is it? We have reporters asking why disaster equipment failed. Caldwell frowned. How would they know? They've spoken with firefighters. Before Caldwell could answer, Ethan Brooks approached. We need one message. What message? Equipment issues were isolated incidents. Grace happened to be walking past when she heard those words. She stopped. Isolated. Brooks turned. I'm speaking with the director. Grace stepped closer. No. Her voice remained calm. You're speaking about my patients. The hallway fell silent. Brooks folded his arms. We'll determine the cause after the investigation. Grace looked him directly in the eyes. We already know part of the cause. He raised an eyebrow. Do we? She nodded toward the failed ventilator sitting against the wall. Machines don't skip maintenance by themselves. For the first time, Brooks looked genuinely uncomfortable. Later that morning, Jason, the biomedical technician, found Grace near the nurse's station. I remembered something. She looked up. What? I kept copies. Copies of what? The replacement requests. Grace's expression changed. You still have them? Jason nodded. I never throw anything away. He reached into his backpack and removed a thick envelope. Inside were dozens of maintenance requests. Everyone stamped. Deferred. Budget hold. Executive review required. Grace slowly flipped through the pages. Each carried dates stretching back nearly 9 months. One request caught her attention. Portable ventilator fleet. Status. Replacement urgent. Final decision. Denied. Approved by Chief Operations Executive Ethan Brooks. Grace closed the folder. She wasn't angry. She was disappointed. People had tried to prevent this. They simply hadn't been heard. Meanwhile, Olivia received a secure email from the State Department of Public Health. Emergency investigators arriving within 2 hours. She immediately walked to Dr. Caldwell's office. They're coming. He nodded slowly. I expected that. Olivia placed the copied documents on his desk. We have a choice. He looked at her. What choice? We protect the hospital. She paused. Or we protect the truth. Caldwell looked through the office window toward the emergency department below. Grace was helping an exhausted janitor move supply carts because every available employee mattered. She wasn't thinking about lawsuits, or promotions, or politics. She was simply doing what needed to be done. Caldwell finally spoke. The hospital survives if people trust it. Olivia nodded. Yes. And trust doesn't come from hiding mistakes. He picked up the entire stack of documents. When the investigators arrive, he took a deep breath. They get everything. As snow continued falling outside, the first vehicles from the Colorado Department of Public Health turned into the hospital entrance. State investigators stepped out carrying briefcases and evidence cases. Television cameras immediately followed them. Inside the hospital, Ethan Brooks watched from an upstairs window. His confident expression faded for the first time that day, because he realized something had changed. This was no longer just a medical emergency. It had become an investigation. And somewhere inside the hospital, the paper trail he thought had disappeared was waiting for the investigators. The first state investigator stepped through the revolving doors at exactly 8:14 a.m. Conversations throughout the lobby faded into uneasy silence. They weren't wearing police uniforms. They didn't need to. Their navy jackets bore the seal of the Colorado Department of Public Health, and each carried a thick evidence case instead of a medical bag. Leading the team was Rebecca Sloan, a veteran investigator with 20 years of experience examining hospital failures after natural disasters, industrial accidents, and public health emergencies. She paused just inside the entrance and took in the scene. Volunteers handed out blankets to waiting families. Doctors hurried between elevators. Nurses who had been awake for nearly 24 hours still refused to go home. This wasn't a hospital collapsing under pressure. It was a hospital refusing to quit. Rebecca turned to her team. Before we interview administrators, she nodded toward the emergency department. I want to see who's actually running this place. Inside the emergency department, Grace was helping transfer a patient to intensive care when Maya hurried toward her. Grace, what happened? There are investigators here. Grace adjusted the patient's blanket. Good. You don't seem surprised. I'm not. Maya lowered her voice. People are saying they're looking into the equipment failures. Grace gave a small nod. They should. What if they ask you questions? Grace looked directly at her. I'll answer them. Even if it causes problems? Grace smiled sadly. Maya. She gently squeezed the younger nurse's shoulder. If telling the truth causes problems. She looked around the exhausted emergency department. Then the problem was already here. Dr. Nathan Caldwell met Rebecca Sloan in the Emergency Operations Center. She introduced herself with a firm handshake. Director Caldwell. Ms. Sloan. I appreciate your cooperation. You'll have it. Rebecca studied him carefully. She'd investigated enough disasters to recognize the difference between honest exhaustion and calculated nervousness. Caldwell looked tired. Not defensive. That mattered. We'll need unrestricted access to maintenance records, staffing schedules, preparedness audits, and executive communications. You'll have them, and everyone involved will be available for interviews. They will. Rebecca noticed something unusual. Most administrators began investigations by asking what information could remain confidential. Caldwell hadn't asked once. Instead, he'd opened every door before she requested it. Interesting. Meanwhile, Ethan Brooks stood outside the conference room, speaking quietly into his phone. No. He paced slowly. We're not discussing this over the phone. He listened. I understand the exposure. Another pause. Legal can handle that later. His jaw tightened. What matters now is controlling the narrative. He ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. When he turned around, Olivia Chun was standing at the end of the hallway. She hadn't heard the conversation, but she had seen enough. Brooks forced a polite smile. Busy morning. Olivia returned a professional nod. It is. Investigators keeping everyone occupied? They're asking good questions. His smile faded just slightly. I'm sure they are. As he walked away, Olivia noticed something she hadn't before. For the first time since she'd known Ethan Brooks, he looked worried. Downstairs, Rebecca Sloan entered the emergency department accompanied by one assistant. She expected to find confusion. Instead, she found order. Patients were moving efficiently between treatment areas. Nurses communicated clearly without shouting. Every available space had been converted into organized care stations. Rebecca watched quietly for several minutes before turning to a nearby paramedic. Who's coordinating all this? The paramedic didn't hesitate. Nurse Holloway. Rebecca followed his gaze. Grace was kneeling beside an elderly man, explaining every step before inserting in 4. No cameras. No audience. No attempt to impress anyone. Just calm professionalism. Rebecca asked another nurse the same question. The answer was identical. Then a respiratory therapist. Same answer. Then a surgeon. Again, Nurse Grace Holloway. Interesting. Rebecca walked toward her. Ms. Holloway. Grace looked up. Yes. I'm Rebecca Sloan with the Department of Public Health. Grace stood. How can I help you? I'd like to ask a few questions. Grace glanced toward a patient monitor that suddenly began alarming. I'm sorry. She immediately moved toward the room. My patients come first. Rebecca watched her disappear through the doorway. Instead of feeling ignored, she smiled. That was exactly the answer she'd hoped for. An hour later, the emergency department finally experienced its first quiet moment since the disaster began. Rebecca approached Grace again. Now. Grace nodded. Now. They stepped into an empty consultation room. Rebecca opened a notebook. I've spoken with 14 employees today. Grace waited silently. They've all told me the same thing. What thing? That this department would have collapsed without you. Grace shook her head immediately. No. Rebecca looked surprised. No. It would have looked different. Grace answered honestly. But people here would have still fought for every patient. Rebecca made a note. Then she asked, Can you explain why you were suspended yesterday? Grace took a slow breath. She told the story exactly as it happened. No exaggeration. No blame. No anger. Only facts. When she finished, Rebecca closed her notebook. Did anyone pressure you to transfer that patient? Grace thought carefully. Pressure. Yes. She nodded. I was given an administrative directive, and you ignored it. I did. Why? Grace looked through the consultation room window toward the busy emergency department. Then she answered with quiet certainty. Because medicine isn't about moving patients. She turned back toward Rebecca. It's about saving them. Rebecca didn't write for several seconds. Instead, she simply looked at Grace. Sometimes, the shortest answers revealed the strongest character. Rebecca Sloan closed her notebook but didn't stand. Instead, she asked one final question. Ms. Holloway, if you had followed the transfer order, do you believe that construction worker would still be alive today? Grace didn't answer immediately. She had replayed that decision in her mind dozens of times over the past 24 hours, not because she regretted it, but because every emergency decision deserved honest reflection. Finally, she met Rebecca's eyes. No. Rebecca waited. Grace continued quietly. I think you would have died in the ambulance before reaching the other hospital. The investigator nodded once. I appreciate your honesty. I didn't come here to defend myself. Then why are you answering my questions? Grace glanced toward the emergency department. Because if something in this hospital failed, her voice softened. The next hospital should learn from it. Rebecca smiled faintly. That wasn't the answer of someone trying to protect a career. It was the answer of someone trying to protect strangers. Across the hall, the investigation team had begun reviewing maintenance records with Jason, the biomedical technician. Rebecca's assistant spread dozens of work orders across a conference table. Each one carried the same sequence. Equipment reported. Urgent replacement requested. Funding delayed. Again, and again, and again. The assistant frowned. How many ventilators were flagged? Jason checked his logbook. 11. And how many were replaced? Jason looked down. 2. The room fell silent. What about the remaining 9? They stayed in service. Were they safe? Jason answered carefully. They met minimum operational standards. The assistant looked up. But not recommended standards. Jason nodded. Correct. In another interview room, Dr. Nathan Caldwell sat alone with Rebecca Sloan. She placed several documents in front of him. Director Caldwell. He looked at the papers. These budget revisions required executive approval. They did. Your signature appears on the annual operating budget. It does. But these departmental reductions were approved afterward. Caldwell studied the pages. For the first time, he noticed handwritten amendments added after the board meeting. Small changes, easy to overlook. Together, they redirected millions of dollars originally intended for emergency preparedness. Rebecca asked quietly, Did you authorize these revisions? He looked up. No. Did you know they existed? No. Rebecca leaned back. I believe you. He looked surprised. You do? I've interviewed administrators who lie. She closed the folder. They usually talk too much. Caldwell let out a long breath. I became a physician because I wanted to help people. Rebecca waited. Somewhere along the way, he stared through the window toward the emergency department. I started managing reports instead of listening to the people creating them. For the first time in years, Dr. Nathan Caldwell admitted his greatest failure wasn't making the wrong decision. It was trusting the wrong information. Meanwhile, Ethan Brooks sat in his executive office reviewing emails when legal counsel entered without knocking. We have a problem. Brooks didn't look up. I assumed we would. The investigators have the maintenance records. So, they also have the preparedness audits. Brooks finally looked up. His expression remained calm. Those don't prove negligence. The attorney hesitated. No. But combined with staffing reductions. She paused. They establish a pattern. Brooks stood and walked toward the window. Outside, television reporters continued broadcasting live. The public won't understand budget decisions. They won't need to. The attorney answered honestly. They'll understand preventable risk. For the first time since the disaster began, Brooks had no response. Back downstairs, Grace helped transport the final critical patient from surgery to intensive care. The young firefighter she'd treated earlier opened his eyes briefly. "Am I alive?" Grace smiled. "You are." He looked around weakly. "My crew. They're waiting upstairs." A tear rolled down his cheek. "I thought." He couldn't finish. Grace gently adjusted his blanket. "You don't have to talk." Before the ICU doors closed, he reached for her hand. "Thank you." Grace squeezed it gently. "I'm just glad you're still here." As the elevator doors closed, Maya walked beside her. "You know something?" "What?" "I've never seen this hospital like this." Grace looked around. Doctors were thanking janitors. Surgeons were helping transport patients. Executives were carrying supply boxes. Titles had disappeared. Only teamwork remained. She smiled. "I hope it stays that way." Late that afternoon, Rebecca Sloan requested one final meeting. Present were Dr. Nathan Caldwell, Olivia Chun, Ethan Brooks, hospital legal counsel, 2 state investigators. Rebecca placed a single folder in the center of the table. "This is not our final report." Nobody spoke. "But we have reached one preliminary conclusion." She opened the folder. The tunnel collapse was unavoidable. Several people nodded. However, she looked directly at everyone. Multiple failures inside this hospital were preventable. Silence. Rebecca continued. "Our investigation indicates repeated warnings regarding emergency staffing, equipment replacement, disaster preparedness, and infrastructure upgrades." She paused. Many of those warnings were delayed for financial reasons. Every eye slowly turned toward Ethan Brooks. He remained perfectly still. Rebecca wasn't finished. "We have not reached conclusions regarding individual legal responsibility." Another pause. "But we will." The room grew painfully quiet. Dr. Caldwell slowly stood. For several seconds, no one knew what he intended to say. Finally, he looked around the room. As director of this hospital, his voice remained steady. "I accept responsibility for every decision made under my leadership." Brooks immediately interrupted. "Director, with respect." Caldwell raised one hand. "No." He turned toward Rebecca. "If my staff warned us." He looked toward Olivia. "And those warnings never reached me." Then toward the emergency department where Grace continued working, completely unaware of the meeting. Then leadership failed them. The room remained silent. Because everyone understood what those words meant. For the first time since the disaster began, someone in authority had stopped protecting a position and started protecting the truth. As the meeting ended, Rebecca quietly handed Caldwell a sealed envelope. He looked at the label. Personnel recommendation, immediate review. He opened it. Inside was a single page. At the top, in bold letters, recommendation, immediate reinstatement of registered nurse Grace Holloway, pending final investigation. Caldwell looked up slowly. Outside the conference room, Grace walked past carrying fresh blankets to recovering patients, completely unaware that her future had just changed. The hospital had survived the first 24 hours. Now came the part no one ever prepared for. Exhaustion. The emergency department no longer echoed with ambulance sirens, but with something quieter, fatigue. Nurses leaned against counters for a few precious seconds between patients. Surgeons removed masks with trembling hands. Coffee cups sat untouched, growing cold beside stacks of handwritten charts. Grace checked the assignment board. 31 patients remained hospitalized. 9 were still in critical condition. The crisis wasn't over. It had simply changed. "Grace." She turned to find Dr. Lucas Ramirez walking toward her. His scrubs were wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. "I need your opinion." She followed him into the intensive care unit. Inside, 12-year-old Liam Foster lay connected to a ventilator. He had been riding on the tour bus with his grandparents when the tunnel ceiling collapsed. His grandparents had survived. Barely. Liam's condition had worsened overnight. Lucas pointed toward the monitor. His lungs are failing. Grace reviewed the latest blood gases. Oxygen saturation keeps dropping. Lucas nodded. We've tried everything. Grace stepped beside Liam's bed. His mother stood silently in the corner, clutching a stuffed dinosaur that had somehow survived the crash. She looked at Grace with desperate eyes. Please. Her voice barely existed. Don't let him die. Grace gently squeezed her hand. We're not giving up. At that same moment, another emergency call reached the ICU. A 58-year-old school bus driver who had also survived the tunnel collapse had suddenly gone into respiratory failure. Only one advanced portable ventilator remained immediately available. Lucas looked toward Grace, then toward Liam, then toward the incoming patient. The room became painfully quiet. One ventilator. Two critically ill patients. Grace closed her eyes for a single second. This was the nightmare every emergency nurse prayed would never happen. How long until another ventilator arrives? Grace asked. The respiratory supervisor answered immediately. At least 45 minutes. Too long. Liam didn't have 45 minutes. Neither did the bus driver. Lucas spoke quietly. We have to choose. The words felt heavier than the silence that followed. Grace looked first at Liam, then at the incoming patient rolling through the ICU doors. The bus driver's oxygen levels were collapsing even faster. Around them, the staff waited. Nobody wanted to make this decision. Grace took a slow breath. No. Lucas looked at her. No. We're not choosing who deserves to live. She turned toward the respiratory therapist. Bring me every transport ventilator in the building. They're older models. I know. They're less reliable. I know. They're not designed for long-term ICU support. Grace looked directly at him. They're designed to breathe. Within minutes, for older transport ventilators were lined up against the wall. Most hadn't been used in months. Grace examined each one personally. One failed its startup test. Another had a cracked display. The third worked perfectly. The fourth started after a second attempt. She looked at Lucas. We can stabilize one patient on the transport unit until the new ventilator arrives. It isn't ideal. No. She looked toward Liam's mother. But it's a chance. Lucas nodded. Let's do it. For the next 30 minutes. Every nurse in the ICU worked with absolute concentration. When the replacement ventilator finally arrived from another hospital, both patients were still alive. The respiratory supervisor looked at Grace in disbelief. I honestly didn't think we'd make it. Grace smiled tiredly. Neither did I. Downstairs, Olivia Chen sat alone in her office making digital copies of every document investigators had requested. Maintenance logs, budget amendments, executive emails, preparedness audits. She clicked save one last time, then paused. A new email had appeared. From Ethan Brooks. Subject, meeting immediately. She opened it. Only one sentence. Bring all disaster-related documents to my office. Do not make additional copies. Olivia stared at the screen. Her instincts immediately told her something was wrong. Instead of gathering the original files, she quietly copied everything onto an encrypted flash drive. Then she locked the originals inside a fireproof cabinet. Just as she closed the drawer, someone knocked on her office door. 3 slow knocks. She looked up. Ethan Brooks stood outside with a polite smile. Olivia. She opened the door. You wanted to see me? I did. His tone remained friendly. I think we should review the investigation files together. Olivia forced a calm expression. Of course. But inside, she already knew. This conversation had nothing to do with reviewing paperwork. Olivia followed Ethan Brooks down the executive hallway without saying a word. The corridor felt strangely quiet. Most administrative offices had emptied as managers assisted with disaster recovery, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and distant hospital announcements. Brooks held his office door open. After you. Olivia stepped inside. He closed the door gently behind them. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Brooks poured 2 cups of coffee. You've had a long night. I think everyone has. He slid 1 cup toward her. You've always been one of our most dependable employees. Olivia didn't touch the coffee. What do you need, Ethan? He folded his hands. The investigators are asking questions. They are. They don't always understand how hospitals operate. Olivia remained silent. Brooks leaned forward. Budget decisions are complicated. They can be. Sometimes upgrades have to wait. Sometimes. He studied her carefully. Context matters. Olivia finally met his eyes. So does accountability. The room grew still. Brooks' smile faded. I've always respected your professionalism. I appreciate that. I hope you'll remember that when investigators ask about internal discussions. Olivia understood exactly what he was saying. He wasn't asking her to lie. He was asking her to leave certain details out. She answered calmly. They're asking for facts. And they'll receive facts. Brooks slowly leaned back. I was hoping you'd be more flexible. Olivia stood. I'm afraid patient safety isn't flexible. Without another word, she walked toward the door. As it closed behind her, Brooks remained seated in silence. For the first time in years, someone inside the executive offices had refused to protect him. Meanwhile, Grace finally left the intensive care unit to check on families gathered in the hospital chapel. Some sat quietly in prayer. Others stared blankly at the floor, waiting for updates they were terrified to receive. An elderly woman approached her. Excuse me. Grace smiled gently. Yes, ma'am. My husband. Her hands trembled. He was driving the second bus. Grace recognized her immediately. She had spoken with her twice during the night. His surgery went well. Tears filled the woman's eyes. They told me he might not survive. Grace nodded softly. He still has a difficult road ahead. The woman reached into her purse. She removed a folded photograph. My husband carries this everywhere. Grace looked at the picture. 3 grandchildren stood beside an old fishing boat, smiling into the camera. He keeps saying he promised to teach the youngest how to fish this summer. The woman's voice broke. I just want him to have that chance. Grace gently folded the photograph and placed it back into her hand. We're going to keep fighting for him. The woman suddenly embraced Grace. Not because Grace had promised a miracle, because she'd offered something just as important. Hope. Late that afternoon, investigators gathered everyone involved in the disaster response inside the hospital auditorium. Doctors, nurses, EMS personnel, firefighters, administrative leaders. Nearly 200 exhausted people filled the room. Rebecca Sloan stepped to the podium. I know everyone is tired. A few quiet laughs spread through the audience. I'll keep this brief. She looked around the room. Our investigation is continuing. A large screen behind her displayed a timeline of the disaster response. The tunnel collapse created circumstances no hospital could completely control. She clicked the next slide. But what happened after those patients arrived? Another slide appeared showing emergency response times. Deserves recognition. She highlighted one graph. Despite receiving 57 victims in a compressed time frame. Another click. This hospital achieved one of the highest disaster survival rates our department has ever documented. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Rebecca continued. That result was not luck. She pointed toward the emergency department staff seated together. It happened because hundreds of people refused to give up. Applause slowly began. Doctors applauded nurses. Nurses applauded paramedics. Paramedics applauded housekeeping staff. The applause grew louder. Then Rebecca raised one hand. Before we finish, the room became quiet again. I'd like to recognize one decision. She looked toward Grace. The decision to return after being suspended. Every head turned. Grace looked genuinely uncomfortable. Rebecca smiled. You had every legal right to stay home. Grace didn't answer. Instead, Rebecca continued. You came back. Silence filled the auditorium. You didn't ask whether you still had a job. You didn't ask who would receive credit. You asked only one question. Rebecca paused. Where am I needed? Many nurses lowered their heads. Some quietly wiped away tears. Grace wished the attention would end. She hadn't returned for applause. She'd returned because patients were waiting. After the gathering ended, Dr. Nathan Caldwell asked Grace to remain. The auditorium slowly emptied until only the two of them remained. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Caldwell walked toward her. I owe you an apology. Grace looked at him quietly. I judged you based on reports. He took a slow breath. I should have spoken with you first. Grace nodded. Thank you. He looked surprised. That's all. She smiled gently. The apology isn't for me. He frowned slightly. No. It's for every nurse who worries that doing the right thing might cost them their career. Those words struck him harder than any accusation could have. He realized she wasn't thinking about herself. She was thinking about the next young nurse who might someday face the same impossible choice. Caldwell reached into his jacket. He removed an official document. I received this from the investigators. Grace accepted it. She unfolded the single page. At the top, in bold letters, it read, Immediate recommendation. Reinstate registered nurse Grace Holloway to full clinical duties pending final review. She looked up. Caldwell smiled for the first time in days. If you'll accept it. He extended his hand. Welcome back. Grace looked at the hand for a moment before shaking it. Around them, the lights in the empty auditorium slowly dimmed. Outside, snow had finally stopped falling. But the biggest battle was still ahead. State investigators had only begun uncovering the financial decisions behind the tragedy. And Ethan Brooks knew that once the final report was released, his entire career, and perhaps much more, would be on the line. 3 months later, the snow that had buried Denver the night of the tunnel collapse had long since melted, but its memory lingered inside Rocky Mountain Regional Medical Center. The emergency department looked different now. New trauma monitors lined every treatment room. Portable ventilators had been replaced. Additional nurses filled the overnight schedule. Fresh emergency supply carts stood along every hallway. Every change represented a lesson written in someone else's suffering. Grace paused outside the ambulance entrance before beginning her shift. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about the investigation. She was thinking about patients. Exactly where she wanted her focus to be. As she clipped her ID badge onto her scrubs, Maya hurried toward her. You've seen the news? Grace smiled. I've been at Emma's school all morning. Maya held up her phone. The state released the final report. Grace's expression became serious. What did it say? Maya handed her the phone. The headline filled the screen. State report finds preventable failures in hospital disaster preparedness. Grace quietly read the opening paragraphs. The investigation concluded that the tunnel collapse itself could not have been prevented, but several internal hospital failures had increased operational risk. Staffing shortages. Delayed equipment replacement. Deferred emergency preparedness projects. Poor executive oversight. She handed the phone back. That's fair. Maya looked surprised. Fair. Grace nodded. The truth usually is. Upstairs, the board of directors gathered for the most important meeting in the hospital's recent history. Every chair was occupied. Legal counsel sat quietly against one wall. Rebecca Sloan attended as an observer representing the Department of Public Health. Dr. Nathan Caldwell stood at the head of the table. He looked around slowly. I've reviewed the final report. No one interrupted. It identifies mistakes. He paused. Some were mine. Several board members exchanged glances. It also identifies actions that violated both hospital policy and public trust. He opened a folder. The evidence confirms that emergency preparedness recommendations were repeatedly delayed through executive budget revisions without appropriate disclosure. Every eye shifted toward Ethan Brooks. Brooks remained calm. I acted within my authority. Caldwell nodded. You acted within your authority. He closed the folder. But not within your responsibility. Silence filled the room. The board chair finally spoke. Mr. Brooks. She looked directly at him. Effective immediately, your employment with Rocky Mountain Regional Medical Center is terminated. No dramatic argument followed. No shouting. No threats. Brooks simply gathered his briefcase. As he reached the door, he paused. I never intended for anyone to get hurt. Caldwell answered quietly. I believe you. Brooks looked back. But good intentions don't replace good decisions. For the first time, Ethan Brooks had no response. He walked out without another word. Meanwhile, Grace had no idea the meeting had ended. She was helping a frightened little girl who needed 6 stitches after falling off her bicycle. The child hid behind her father. I don't want the needle. Grace smiled. Can I tell you a secret? The little girl peeked around her dad's arm. What? I didn't like needles when I was your age either. You didn't? Nope. The little girl looked suspicious. Really? Grace laughed. Really? She picked up a marker. What if we draw a superhero on your cast afterward? The little girl's eyes brightened. Can it be Wonder Woman? I think Wonder Woman would approve. The father quietly smiled. For the first time since arriving, his daughter stopped crying. Later that afternoon, Grace received an unexpected message. Director Caldwell requests your presence in conference room A. She sighed. I just got my job back. Maya laughed. Maybe you're getting suspended again. Grace rolled her eyes. Don't even joke. She walked upstairs wondering what new complication awaited. When she opened the conference room door, everyone inside stood. Board members, department chiefs, doctors, nurses, paramedics, even the housekeeping supervisor who had worked through the disaster. Grace stopped in confusion. What? Dr. Caldwell stepped forward. I've called this meeting for one reason. He looked around the room. Recognition. Grace immediately shook her head. No. Several people laughed softly. I don't need. Caldwell gently interrupted. This isn't about what you need. He looked toward the audience. It's about what they deserve to say. One by one, people stood. Captain Marcus Reed spoke first. I've worked disasters for 26 years. He looked directly at Grace. I've never trusted anyone more in an emergency. Next came Sophie. The young nurse's hand still trembled slightly as she spoke. The night of the tunnel collapse. She smiled through tears. I thought I wasn't strong enough to be a nurse. She looked toward Grace. You believed in me before I believed in myself. Then Jason from biomedical engineering stood. If someone had listened to people like Grace sooner. He paused. Our equipment would have been ready. One after another. Voices filled the room. Not praising perfection, praising leadership, praising integrity, praising compassion. Grace quietly wiped away a tear. She had spent months believing she'd failed her hospital. Only now did she realize. Her hospital had been learning from her all along. Grace stood speechless as the room fell silent again. She looked around at the faces before her. Some she had worked beside for years. Others she had only met during the tunnel disaster. Every one of them had a story. Every one of them had carried someone to safety. Every one of them had sacrificed sleep, comfort, and certainty for strangers they would probably never see again. She slowly shook her head. I don't know what to say. Dr. Caldwell smiled. That's unusual. A ripple of laughter eased the emotion in the room. Grace took a deep breath. If you're thanking me. She looked around at everyone. Then you're thanking the wrong person. Several people exchanged confused looks. She continued. I wasn't alone that night. She pointed toward Maya. Maya skipped every break because she refused to leave her patients. Then toward Sophie. Sophie performed the first emergency intubation of her career. She turned toward Jason. Jason kept broken equipment working long enough for replacements to arrive. She smiled at Captain Marcus Reed. Marcus and his firefighters pulled people out of that tunnel while concrete was still falling. She looked toward the housekeeping supervisor. Your team cleaned trauma rooms in minutes so we could receive the next patient. Then she looked at Dr. Ramirez. You trusted me when it would have been easier to follow orders. Finally, she faced Dr. Caldwell. And you told the truth when protecting yourself would have been much easier. The room remained silent. Grace smiled gently. The night people keep calling a miracle. She shook her head. Wasn't a miracle. It was teamwork. Applause filled the room. This time, it wasn't for one nurse. It was for everyone who had refused to give up. A week later, the hospital auditorium was once again full. This time, there were no investigators, no emergency briefings, no television cameras broadcasting a disaster. Instead, hospital employees, city officials, firefighters, paramedics, former patients, and their families gathered for a celebration. At the front of the room stood a covered bronze plaque. Dr. Caldwell stepped to the podium. 3 months ago, he paused. Our hospital faced the greatest challenge in its history. He looked around the room. We made mistakes. No one looked away. We also witnessed extraordinary courage. He smiled toward Grace, who sat quietly beside Emma and Samuel in the third row. When the investigation concluded, I asked myself one question. He paused. What should future generations remember? He nodded toward the plaque. I found my answer. He pulled away the blue cloth. The audience collectively gasped. The bronze plaque read, The Grace Holloway Center for Emergency Excellence, dedicated to the healthcare professionals who choose courage, compassion, and integrity when lives depend on it. Grace's eyes filled with tears. She immediately whispered, No. Emma squeezed her mother's hand. I told you they'd do something. Grace laughed softly through tears. This is too much. Samuel, who had rarely shown emotion since returning from Vietnam decades earlier, quietly wiped his eyes. I've never been prouder. After the ceremony, reporters surrounded Grace outside the hospital. Microphones extended toward her. CNN, The Denver Post, Colorado Public Radio, Channel 7 News. One reporter spoke first. Nurse Holloway. She smiled politely. Grace is fine. What does it feel like knowing this center now carries your name? Grace thought for a moment. Then she looked back at the emergency department entrance. An ambulance had just arrived. Paramedics were already unloading another patient. The emergency department never stopped. She smiled. It feels temporary. The reporter looked confused. Temporary. Grace nodded. Buildings don't save people. She pointed toward the ambulance bay. People do. Another reporter asked, "Would you ever consider becoming hospital director?" Grace laughed. "I appreciate the thought. So no." She looked toward the sliding emergency doors. "I belong where patients first arrive." That evening, Grace finished another 12-hour shift. Nothing extraordinary had happened. A broken arm, 2 heart attacks, a frightened teenager, an elderly couple involved in a minor car accident. An ordinary day in emergency medicine. Exactly the kind of day she loved. As she walked toward the parking lot, Emma waited beside Samuel's old pickup truck. "You ready?" Grace smiled. "I am." Emma handed her a small envelope. "Someone asked me to give you this." There wasn't a name. Grace opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. No signature. Only a single sentence. "Thank you for reminding all of us why we became doctors in the first place." She looked around the parking lot. Whoever had written it was already gone. She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her wallet beside the faded thank you card she had carried for years. 2 simple reminders. 2 different patients. 1 lifelong purpose. Samuel started the truck. As they drove away, the hospital disappeared slowly in the rearview mirror. The building looked exactly the same. But inside, its culture had changed forever. Young nurses now knew they would be heard. Doctors asked more questions before accepting administrative decisions. Maintenance requests were reviewed immediately. Emergency drills became more frequent. Board meetings began with patient safety instead of financial projections. The tunnel disaster would always be remembered as one of the darkest nights in the hospital's history. But it would also be remembered for something else. The night hundreds of ordinary people proved that compassion is stronger than fear. That truth is stronger than convenience. And that leadership isn't measured by the office someone occupies. It's measured by the lives they protect. Grace never became famous. She never wrote a book. She never sought recognition. The next morning, she walked back through the emergency department doors wearing the same blue scrubs, carrying the same worn coffee mug, and greeting every patient with the same quiet smile. Because to her, the greatest honor was never having a building named after her. It was hearing a frightened patient whisper, "I'm glad you're my nurse." And for Grace Holloway, that was more than enough.